I'm Natalie Chen, 32 years old, and I never imagined that the text message from my father would be the catalyst that exposed his entire criminal empire. When those words appeared on my screen, "Don't come to the gala. You're an embarrassment to this family," I felt the familiar sting of rejection that had defined our relationship for years. What my father didn't know was that my fiancé Derek wasn't just a federal agent. He was the lead investigator on a case that would bring my father's carefully constructed world crashing down around him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Seattle, I was always the daughter who didn't quite fit the mold my father had envisioned. Richard Chen had built his technology consulting firm from the ground up, transforming it into a powerhouse that served Fortune 500 companies across the Pacific Northwest. Our home in Mercer Island was a sprawling estate with views of Lake Washington, the kind of place featured in architecture magazines. My mother Elena had been a concert pianist before marriage, and together they created the image of the perfect Asian American success story. But beneath that polished exterior lived a truth that would take me decades to fully comprehend. My older brother Marcus was everything my father wanted in an heir. He excelled at mathematics, graduated top of his class from Stanford, and joined my father's company immediately after earning his MBA. He wore tailored suits, spoke Mandarin fluently, and could discuss market projections with the same ease that most people talked about the weather. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. I preferred literature to ledgers, chose social work over software engineering, and had the audacity to date outside the carefully curated circle of families my father deemed appropriate. The rejection started early, though I didn't recognize it as such when I was young. When I was 7, I won first place in my school's creative writing contest with a story about a girl who could talk to trees. My father glanced at the certificate for barely 3 seconds before returning to his laptop. "Writing stories won't pay the bills, Natalie," he said without looking up. "Focus on your math homework." My mother tried to compensate with enthusiasm, hanging my certificate on the refrigerator, but even at that age, I understood whose approval really mattered in our household. By the time I reached high school, the dynamic had solidified into an unspoken understanding. Marcus was the golden child, the one who received praise, attention, and investment in his future. I was the obligation, the daughter who needed to be managed and contained rather than celebrated. When Marcus got accepted to Stanford, my father threw a party with over 100 guests. When I received admission to the University of Washington with a scholarship, my father simply nodded and said, "At least you'll be close to home where we can keep an eye on you." College became my escape. I threw myself into psychology and sociology courses, volunteering at crisis centers and discovering a passion for helping people navigate trauma and systemic barriers. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had purpose beyond being a disappointment. I made friends who valued empathy over achievement, who measured success in lives touched rather than dollars earned. My father viewed my chosen path with barely concealed disdain. "You're wasting your potential," he told me when I announced my intention to pursue a master's in social work. "You could have been something significant." Those words cut deeper than he probably intended, or perhaps exactly as deep as he meant them to. The implication was clear. What I wanted to become wasn't significant. Helping vulnerable populations, advocating for foster children, supporting domestic violence survivors, none of that mattered in Richard Chen's worldview. Only money, status, and power held value. After graduate school, I took a position at a nonprofit organization that worked with at-risk youth in South Seattle. The pay was modest, the hours were long, and the emotional toll was significant. But I loved it. For the first time, I felt like I was making a real difference in the world. My father stopped asking about my work entirely, changing the subject whenever I tried to share stories about the kids I was helping. At family dinners, he would dominate the conversation with discussions of Marcus's latest business triumph while I sat silently, invisible in my own family. My mother tried to bridge the gap in her own way, calling me weekly to check in, attending my work events when she could slip away without my father noticing. But she was trapped in her own cage, having given up her musical career to become Mrs. Richard Chen, and she didn't have the strength to challenge the man who had systematically diminished both of us over the years. "He loves you in his own way," she would say, the same excuse I'd heard since childhood. He just doesn't know how to show it. I met Derek Sullivan at a community safety workshop 3 years ago. The Seattle Police Department had partnered with our nonprofit to create better protocols for handling calls involving minors, and Derek was there representing the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit. He was tall, with kind hazel eyes and an unassuming demeanor that put people at ease immediately. While other law enforcement officials at the meeting seemed defensive about criticism of police practices, Derek listened thoughtfully, took notes, and asked genuine questions about how federal agencies could better support vulnerable populations. We started talking during the coffee break, and what began as a professional conversation quickly became personal. Derek shared that he'd grown up in foster care himself, bouncing between 7 different homes before aging out of the system at 18. He joined the military, used the GI Bill to put himself through college, and eventually found his way to the FBI. "I wanted to be the person who showed up for kids who had nobody," he explained. "The system failed me in a lot of ways, but maybe I can help fix it for someone else." I fell in love with him during that first conversation. Not the superficial attraction of physical appearance, though Derek was certainly handsome, but the deeper recognition of someone who understood what it meant to fight for people society had written off. Our relationship developed slowly, built on late-night conversations about systemic injustice, shared meals at hole-in-the-wall restaurants, and a mutual commitment to making the world slightly less broken. When I finally introduced Derek to my family 8 months into our relationship, the dinner was predictably uncomfortable. My father took one look at Derek's off-the-rack suit and sensible sedan and made his assessment immediately. Throughout the meal, he asked pointed questions designed to highlight Derek's modest background. "So your parents weren't in the picture?" my father asked with false sympathy. That must have been difficult, not having proper guidance. Derek handled it with grace, refusing to be baited into defensiveness, but I could see the calculation in my father's eyes. This man wasn't good enough for his daughter, not because of any character flaw, but because he lacked the pedigree and wealth that Richardson valued above all else. After Derek left that evening, my father called me into his study. "I hope you're not serious about this man," he said without preamble. "He's a government employee with no prospects. You could do so much better, Natalie. The Chang family has a son who just made partner at his law firm. Very successful, very appropriate." The message was clear. Derek was beneath me, or rather, beneath the family image my father was trying to maintain. I stood my ground for the first time in my life. "I love him," I said firmly. "And I don't care what you think about his background or his salary. Derek is a good man who does important work." My father's expression hardened. "If you marry this man, don't expect me to support your poor choices. You'll be on your own." It was the kind of ultimatum he'd probably expected would bring me to heel, the same manipulation that had worked throughout my childhood. But I wasn't a child anymore. Derek proposed 6 months later during a hike in the Cascades. It was simple and perfect, just the two of us on a mountain trail with wildflowers blooming around us. He didn't have an expensive ring, just a simple gold band with a small diamond that represented months of careful saving. "I can't give you the lifestyle you grew up with," he said as he knelt on the rocky path. "But I can promise you partnership, respect, and a love that doesn't come with conditions." I said yes before he finished the question. Breaking the news to my family went exactly as expected. My mother cried happy tears and immediately started discussing wedding plans. Marcus offered congratulations that seemed genuine enough, though he was clearly distracted by work obligations. My father said nothing at all during the announcement, simply stood and left the room. Later, my mother called to explain that he needed time to adjust to the idea. "You know how he is," she said, making excuses as always. "He just wants what's best for you." The next few months were consumed with wedding planning, or rather, my mother and I planning a wedding while my father pretended it wasn't happening. He refused to discuss venues, wouldn't commit to walking me down the aisle, and made it clear through his silence that he disapproved of everything about my choice. Derek and I decided on a small ceremony at a botanical garden, keeping costs modest and the guest list limited to people who actually supported our union. During this time, Derek's work became increasingly demanding. He'd been promoted to lead investigator on a major financial crimes case, something involving complex corporate fraud that he couldn't discuss in detail. I knew the basics. His team was investigating a network of technology companies suspected of money laundering, securities fraud, and potentially ties to organized crime. The case had been building for over 2 years, and they were finally closing in on the primary targets. "I can't tell you specifics," Derek would say when I asked about his long hours and stressed demeanor. "But this case is big, Natalie. When it breaks, it's going to make national news. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars and connections that go all the way up the corporate ladder." I supported him however I could, understanding that his work, like mine, sometimes required discretion and boundaries. 3 months before our wedding, my father's assistant called to inform me about an upcoming charity gala. The Chen Foundation, my father's pet project, was hosting its annual fundraiser at the Four Seasons, a black tie event that brought together Seattle's elite to raise money for educational initiatives. "Your father would like you to attend," the assistant said in a tone that suggested this wasn't really a request. "He's receiving an award for his philanthropic contributions, and it would look good for the family to be there." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I agreed to attend, assuming this was my father's way of extending an olive branch. Perhaps seeing me at his big event would remind him that I was still his daughter, still part of the family he claimed to value so highly. I bought a new dress, something elegant but not too flashy, and coordinated with my mother about the schedule. Derek would be working late on his case, but he promised to try to make it for at least part of the evening. The text message arrived 2 days before the gala. I was at work, sitting in my office reviewing case files for a teenager who'd been placed in emergency foster care, when my phone buzzed. The message was from my father, which was unusual in itself. He rarely texted me directly, preferring to communicate through my mother or his assistant. "Don't come to the gala. You're an embarrassment to this family." I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, each time hoping I'd somehow misunderstood. But there was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. My father, the man who was supposed to protect and support me, had explicitly disinvited me from his event because my presence would embarrass him. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the rejection, but the deliberate choice to inflict maximum pain with minimum words. My hands shook as I called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice already defensive. "Natalie, I was going to call you," she knew. She had known my father was going to do this and hadn't warned me. "Did you see Dad's message?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He told me not to come to the gala." There was a long pause before my mother spoke. "Your father is under a lot of stress right now. The gala is very important for the foundation's reputation, and he's concerned about how certain relationships might be perceived by the donors." Certain relationships. She meant Derek. My father was so ashamed of my choice of fiancé that he'd rather exclude his own daughter than risk having people know I was engaged to someone he considered beneath our family status. "Mom, he called me an embarrassment," I said, my voice breaking. "How can you defend that?" My mother sighed. "I'm not defending it, honey. I'm trying to help you understand his perspective. These donors give millions of dollars. They have certain expectations about the families they associate with. Your father is just trying to protect the foundation's interests." The conversation continued in circles for another 10 minutes before I hung up, feeling more alone than I had since childhood. My own mother was choosing my father's reputation over my dignity, just as she always had. I sat in my office, staring at that text message, and something inside me shifted. For 32 years, I had accepted my role as the disappointing daughter, the one who didn't measure up to impossible standards. But this was different. This was my father explicitly telling me I was so worthless that my mere presence would tarnish his precious image. When Derek came home that evening, he found me on our couch, still in my work clothes, staring at nothing. "What happened?" he asked immediately, his investigator instincts recognizing that something was seriously wrong. I showed him the text message without saying anything. I watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to anger. "He can't talk to you like this," Derek said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is emotional abuse, Natalie. You know that, right? This isn't just family drama or a disagreement. This is calculated cruelty." I nodded, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "I know. I've always known, I think. But seeing it spelled out like that, it's different somehow." He didn't even pretend to have a legitimate reason. Just straight to telling me I'm an embarrassment. Derek pulled me close, and I cried into his shoulder for what felt like hours. When I finally calmed down, he pulled back to look at me seriously. "I need to tell you something," he said carefully. "Something about the case I've been working on. I probably shouldn't, but given what just happened, I think you have a right to know." My stomach dropped. Something in his tone warned me that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "The major financial crimes case my team has been investigating," Derek began slowly. "The primary target is a technology consulting firm based in Seattle. They've been using their corporate structure to launder money for overseas criminal organizations, falsifying contracts, and defrauding investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars." I felt the color drain from my face as understanding dawned. "Derek, what's the name of the company?" He looked at me with something like pity in his eyes. "Chin Global Solutions. Natalie, your father's company is the center of a massive criminal conspiracy. We've been building this case for 2 years, and we're finally ready to move. The arrests are scheduled to happen at a public event where we can take in multiple targets simultaneously." The room spun around me. My father wasn't just a difficult man with impossible standards. He was a criminal. And the gala, his precious fundraising event where my presence would be so embarrassing, was about to become the site of his very public arrest. "The gala," I whispered. "You're going to arrest him at the gala?" Derek nodded grimly. "We have evidence that several of his co-conspirators will be in attendance. It's the perfect opportunity to execute multiple warrants simultaneously." "Natalie, I'm so sorry. I've wanted to tell you for months, but the investigation required absolute secrecy. If there had been any leak, if your father had gotten wind that we were onto him, he would have destroyed evidence and fled the country." I pulled away from Derek, my mind racing through implications and memories. How many times had I eaten dinner in that house, surrounded by luxury paid for with stolen money? How many family vacations had been funded by criminal enterprise? And my father's contempt for Derek suddenly made perfect sense. Not just classism, but fear. An FBI agent dating his daughter was exactly the kind of connection a criminal would want to avoid. "Did he disinvite me because he knows?" I asked. "Does he suspect you're investigating him?" Derek shook his head. "We don't think so. His lawyers have been dealing with some preliminary SEC inquiries, but nothing that would indicate federal criminal charges are imminent. My guess is he's genuinely just ashamed of me and doesn't want his wealthy friends knowing his daughter is marrying a government employee. The irony is that his own snobbery is going to be his downfall." I spent the next 2 days in a fog, trying to process the revelation that my father was a criminal and that the man I loved was about to arrest him in the most public way possible. Derek gave me the option to skip the gala entirely, to distance myself from what was about to happen. "You don't have to be there," he said gently. "This is going to be traumatic enough without having to witness it firsthand." But something in me had hardened since receiving that text message. My father had spent my entire life making me feel worthless, and his final act before his arrest was to explicitly tell me I was an embarrassment. Fine. If he wanted me gone, I would do exactly the opposite. I would be there to witness the moment his carefully constructed empire collapsed. Not out of revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but out of a need to finally see the truth exposed. "I'm going," I told Derek firmly. He told me not to come because I'm an embarrassment. I want to be there when he discovers what real embarrassment looks like. Derek studied my face for a long moment before nodding. "Okay. But I need you to understand what's going to happen. My team will move in during the dinner service, after the awards are presented. We'll have agents positioned throughout the venue. When we execute the warrants, it's going to be fast and very public. Your father will be arrested in front of everyone he was trying to impress. The night of the gala arrived with unseasonably warm weather for Seattle in March. I dressed carefully in the elegant navy gown I'd purchased weeks ago, when I still thought this would be a normal family obligation. Derek wore a dark suit, his FBI credentials and weapon concealed but present. We drove to the Four Seasons in silence, both lost in our own thoughts about what the evening would bring. The ballroom was spectacular, decorated with dramatic floral arrangements and soft lighting that made everything glow. Guests mingled in designer gowns and tuxedos, champagne flowed freely, and the atmosphere buzzed with the self-satisfied energy of wealthy people congratulating themselves on their generosity. I spotted my mother across the room, looking elegant in a silver dress, standing beside my father who worked the crowd with practiced ease. When my father saw me, his expression went from surprise to fury in less than a second. He excused himself from his conversation and cut through the crowd toward me, my mother trailing behind him looking distressed. "What are you doing here?" he hissed when he reached us, keeping his voice low but his anger barely contained. "I explicitly told you not to come." "I know," I said calmly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But I decided your embarrassment doesn't actually have the power over me that you think it does." My father's face reddened. "You're making a scene. I want you to leave immediately." He hadn't even acknowledged Derek's presence, hadn't said hello or made any pretense of civility. To him, we were simply an inconvenience to be removed. "We're staying," Derek said quietly, the first words he'd spoken since we arrived. "Natalie has every right to be at her father's event." My father finally looked at Derek directly, his expression filled with contempt. "You've put ideas in her head, convinced her to defy her family. This is exactly why you're not the right person for my daughter. You have no understanding of how people like us operate." "People like us," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. "You mean criminals, Dad? Is that how people like you operate?" The color drained from his face for just a moment before he recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about. Natalie, if you're going to be hysterical, I'll have security escort you out." Before the conversation could continue, the lights dimmed and a voice announced that dinner would be served shortly. Guests began moving toward their assigned tables. My mother touched my arm gently. "Please, honey," she whispered. "Just leave quietly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The plea in her voice almost broke my resolve, but I remembered all the times she'd chosen his comfort over my pain. "I'm staying, Mom," I said softly. "And you might want to prepare yourself for what's about to happen." She looked confused, but I walked away before she could ask what I meant, finding my seat at a table far from the family section where my father had deliberately not assigned me a place. The dinner service began with the usual elegance of high society events. Waiters glided between tables delivering carefully plated courses while conversations hummed around topics of investments, vacation homes, and charitable tax deductions. I picked at my food, unable to eat while watching the clock and scanning the room for Derek's team members. He'd pointed out 3 agents earlier, positioned strategically near exits and the main stage, all looking like perfectly ordinary guests in their formal attire. My father sat at the head table on the raised platform, surrounded by other foundation board members and major donors. He held court with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, gesturing expansively as he told some story that had his companions laughing appreciatively. From this distance, he looked exactly like what he pretended to be, a successful businessman and generous philanthropist. Only I knew the truth beneath that polished surface. Marcus sat 2 tables away from me with his wife Jennifer, both of them looking uncomfortable. My brother had texted me earlier in the day, a rare direct communication asking why I was defying Dad's wishes by attending. I hadn't responded, unsure how much Marcus knew about our father's activities. Was he complicit in the fraud, or simply another person our father had manipulated? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The awards ceremony began after the main course. Various community leaders received recognition for their contributions to education initiatives, each giving brief speeches about the importance of investing in youth development. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my father, presenting himself as someone who cared about helping young people, while his criminal activities had probably destroyed countless lives. How many families had lost their savings to his fraud schemes? How many legitimate businesses had been damaged by his money laundering operations? Finally, the master of ceremonies called my father to the stage. Our final honoree tonight needs no introduction. Richard Chen has built one of the most successful technology consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest while maintaining an unwavering commitment to educational excellence. The Chen Foundation has provided scholarships to over 500 students and funded computer labs in 30 schools across Washington state. Please join me in recognizing this year's Philanthropic Leadership Award recipient, Richard Chen. The applause was thunderous as my father made his way to the stage, pausing to shake hands and accept congratulations. He took his position at the podium, adjusting the microphone with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in the spotlight. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice warm and genuine sounding. This award means more to me than I can adequately express. My parents came to this country with nothing, worked minimum wage jobs, and sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they never had. I watched him weave the narrative of his life, the immigrant success story that had become his brand. He talked about building his company from scratch, about the importance of education as a pathway to prosperity, about giving back to communities that had supported him. Not once did he mention his children. Not Marcus, who worked tirelessly at his company, and certainly not me, the embarrassing daughter whose presence he had forbidden. The work we do through this foundation represents my deepest values, my father continued, his voice taking on an emotional quality. Every scholarship we award, every computer lab we build, every student we help achieve their dreams, this is the legacy I want to leave behind. This is what matters. Not wealth or status, but the difference we make in young lives. The hypocrisy of it made my stomach turn. This man, who had rejected his own daughter for not meeting his standards, who had built his fortune on criminal activities, stood there accepting praise for his generosity and moral character. The audience ate it up, some people dabbing at their eyes during particularly moving moments in his speech. As my father's speech concluded to another round of applause, Derek caught my eye from across the room. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. It was time. I watched as he and the other agents began moving, slowly and deliberately, positioning themselves around the room's perimeter. Most guests didn't notice, too focused on my father taking photographs with the award, but I saw everything with crystal clarity. My father had just returned to his seat when Derek stepped onto the stage, his FBI badge held high and clearly visible. The room fell silent as everyone tried to process what they were seeing. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Special Agent Derek Sullivan with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats. We are here to execute federal warrants. The confusion on my father's face was almost comical as he looked from Derek to the other agents now positioned throughout the ballroom. Recognition flickered across his features as he realized who Derek was, my fiancé, the man he dismissed as beneath his family's consideration. Richard Chen, Derek's voice rang out clear and authoritative. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, and racketeering. Please stand and place your hands behind your back. For a moment, my father didn't move. He simply stared at Derek as if he could make this reality disappear through force of will. Then he turned to look directly at me, and the expression on his face was pure venom. He understood immediately. His daughter, the embarrassment, had brought the FBI into his inner circle. Never mind that Derek had been investigating long before we met. In my father's mind, this was my ultimate betrayal. The room erupted in chaos. People stood from their tables, voices rising in shock and confusion. Someone screamed. My mother grabbed my father's arm as if she could physically prevent his arrest, crying out, "No, no, there must be some mistake." Marcus sat frozen at his table, his face pale as he watched federal agents approach our father. 2 agents moved in to handcuff my father while Derek read him his Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The words sounded surreal in this opulent ballroom, overlaying the evening's pretense of elegance with the harsh reality of criminal justice. As they secured the handcuffs, my father fought against the agents, not physically but verbally. This is outrageous. I've done nothing wrong. You're making a huge mistake. His voice had lost its usual polish, becoming shrill with panic. I'll have your badge for this, Sullivan. I'll sue you personally. You've manipulated my daughter into helping you destroy me. Derek remained professionally calm. Mr. Chen, I strongly advise you to stop talking and wait for your attorney. But my father couldn't stop. Years of being the most powerful person in every room had convinced him that consequences didn't apply to him. You're nobody, he spat at Derek. A foster kid who got lucky. You think you can come into my world and destroy what I've built? You're nothing. 3 more agents moved through the crowd, approaching other men at various tables. I recognized 2 of them from family gatherings over the years, business associates of my father's, men who had attended barbecues at our house and given me awkward birthday presents when I was young. They were co-conspirators, all being arrested simultaneously so none could warn the others or destroy evidence. My mother had collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Several women from her social circle had rushed over to comfort her, casting accusatory glances in my direction. They'd figured out the connection between the arresting agent and the Chen family, and in their minds, I was the traitor who had brought this shame upon us all. Marcus pushed through the crowd toward me, his face twisted with emotions I couldn't quite read. Did you know? He demanded when he reached my table. Did you know this was going to happen tonight? I met his eyes steadily. Derek's been investigating for 2 years. I only found out a few days ago. Marcus stepped back as if I'd struck him. You knew for days and didn't warn us? Didn't warn Dad or Mom or me? What kind of person does that? The kind of person who believes in the law, I said quietly. The kind who won't be complicit in covering up crimes. Did you know, Marcus? About what Dad was really doing with the company? My brother's face went ashen. He opened his mouth to respond but no words came out. That was answer enough. He'd known, or at least suspected, and had chosen to look the other way because it benefited him. This will destroy Mom, Marcus finally said. The humiliation, the legal battles, probably losing the house. Was your revenge worth that? His words stung because they touched on the guilt I'd been trying to suppress. My mother wasn't innocent, she'd enabled my father's behavior for decades, but she was still my mother, and yes, this would devastate her. But the alternative was allowing the crimes to continue, allowing more people to be victimized by my father's schemes. This isn't revenge, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. This is justice. Maybe if you'd stood up to him years ago, if any of us had, it wouldn't have come to this. Marcus shook his head bitterly. You always thought you were better than us, Natalie. More moral, more righteous. But look what your righteousness has done. You've destroyed your own family. Before I could respond, Derek appeared at my side. His professional mask slipped for just a moment as he touched my arm gently. Are you okay? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Around us, the gala had devolved into complete pandemonium. Guests were rushing for exits, some trying to get away from the scene while others pulled out phones to document everything. News crews were probably already being alerted. By tomorrow morning, this would be the lead story on every local station. My father was being led out of the ballroom in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence and making threats about lawsuits and ruined careers. As he passed my table, he stopped abruptly, forcing the agents to halt. He looked at me with such pure hatred that I involuntarily flinched. You did this, he said, his voice low and venomous. My own daughter. I should have disowned you years ago when you first started disappointing me. At least then you couldn't have betrayed me like this. Mr. Chen, keep moving, one of the agents said firmly, pulling him forward. But my father wasn't finished. You're nothing, Natalie. You hear me? Nothing. Everything you have, everything you are, came from me, and I will destroy you for this. His voice echoed through the ballroom as they finally managed to get him moving toward the exit. The words hit like physical blows, even though I'd expected something like this. My mother appeared suddenly at my side, her face blotchy from crying, Her carefully applied makeup streaked down her cheeks. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's your father. Whatever he's done, he's still your father. You should have warned us, given us a chance to prepare." "A chance to destroy evidence, you mean?" The words came out harsher than I'd intended. "Mom, he's a criminal. He's been stealing from people, laundering money for organized crime. How many lives has he ruined? How many families?" My mother's hand connected with my cheek before I registered that she was going to hit me. The slap wasn't hard, but the shock of it froze both of us. She'd never struck me before, never been physically aggressive despite all the emotional distance. "You've ruined us," she said, her voice hollow. "Everything we've built, our reputation, our place in this community, gone. Was it worth it, Natalie? Was destroying your family worth whatever moral satisfaction you're feeling right now?" She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the wreckage of the gala with my cheeks stinging and tears threatening to spill over. Derek put his arm around my shoulders. "Let's get you out of here," he said quietly. "My team can handle the rest." I shook my head. "No. I need to see this through. I need to watch him face consequences for once in his life." We stayed as the remaining guests were questioned and released, as crime scene technicians documented everything, as my father and his co-conspirators were loaded into separate vehicles for transport to federal custody. The ballroom that had been so elegant just hours ago now looked like a disaster zone. Abandoned tables with half-eaten dinners, overturned chairs where people had rushed to leave, abandoned purses and jackets in the chaos. My father's award still sat on the head table, a symbol of a reputation that had been obliterated in minutes. I walked over and picked it up, reading the inscription, "For outstanding philanthropic leadership and commitment to educational excellence." "Quite the souvenir," Derek said, appearing beside me. I set the award back down. "No. I don't want anything from him, not even the reminder of his hypocrisy." Derek studied my face in the dim lighting. "You know this is just the beginning, right? The trial will take months, maybe years. Your family will blame you throughout. The media will dig into everything. It's going to get harder before it gets better." I nodded slowly. "I know. But Derek, what choice did I have? Let him keep destroying lives because he happens to be my father? At what point does family loyalty become complicity?" He pulled me close, and I finally let the tears come, crying into his shoulder in the destroyed ballroom while his colleagues worked around us. I cried for the father I'd never really had, for the family that had never truly accepted me, for my mother who would suffer despite her willful blindness, and for the strange grief of watching someone you'd spent your whole life trying to please be revealed as unworthy of that effort. When I finally composed myself, Derek walked me out to our car. The night air was cool and fresh after the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom. News vans were already arriving, reporters setting up to cover the story. "Agent Sullivan," one called out. "Can you comment on the arrest of Richard Chen?" Derek simply shook his head and kept walking, shielding me from their cameras. In the car, I checked my phone for the first time in hours. 17 missed calls from various family members and family friends. Dozens of text messages ranging from concerned to accusatory. One from my mother's sister, "How could you do this to your own mother?" Another from one of Marcus's friends, "You're a snake. Hope you can live with yourself." I turned off my phone without reading the rest. "My aunt thinks I'm a monster," I said to Derek as we drove through the empty streets. "My brother thinks I destroyed the family. My mother slapped me. And my father," I couldn't finish the sentence. The look of pure hatred on his face when he'd been led past me would haunt me for a long time. Derek reached over and took my hand. "You did the right thing. That doesn't always feel good, and it doesn't always get rewarded. But it was still right." We drove in silence for a while before I spoke again. "Do you know what the worst part is? Even after everything, even after he told me I was an embarrassment and spent my whole life making me feel worthless, there's still this little voice in my head asking if I should have protected him anyway. If blood really should be thicker than ethics." Derek considered this carefully before responding. That voice exists because you're a good person who values family. But Natalie, real family doesn't treat you the way your father treated you. Real love doesn't come with conditions and contempt. When we arrived home, I collapsed on the couch, emotionally exhausted. Derek disappeared into the kitchen and returned with chamomile tea, sitting beside me in the quiet darkness of our living room. What happens now? I asked. With the case, I mean. What can I expect? Derek set down his mug. Your father and the other defendants will be arraigned within 72 hours. They'll likely make bail, though the amounts will be substantial. Then we move into the discovery phase. Their lawyers will get to see our evidence, start building their defense. The trial probably won't start for at least a year, maybe longer if they file a lot of pretrial motions. And throughout all of it, the media will be relentless. Will I have to testify? The thought made my stomach churn. Derek shook his head. We don't need you as a witness. Our case is built on financial records, wire communications, testimony from cooperating witnesses who worked for your father. You're not part of the evidentiary chain. That was some relief, at least. I wouldn't have to sit in a courtroom and testify against my own father, wouldn't have to face him across that divide. What about Marcus? I asked. Is he implicated? Derek hesitated. There's evidence he knew about some of the improprieties, but not enough to charge him as part of the conspiracy. He'll probably lose his job and face civil liability, but criminal charges are unlikely unless new evidence surfaces. My brother would escape the worst consequences, though his life would still be irrevocably changed. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed replaying the evening's events, wondering if there had been any other way this could have gone. Could I have warned my mother without compromising the investigation? Should I have skipped the gala as Derek had suggested, spared myself the trauma of watching it all unfold? But even as I questioned my choices, I knew I'd make the same ones again. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that people will hate you for it. The next morning arrived too quickly. My phone, which I'd left off overnight, showed 53 new messages when I reluctantly turned it on. I scrolled through them, my stomach sinking with each one. Former family friends expressing shock and disappointment. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years demanding explanations. A particularly venomous message from my father's sister calling me a disgrace to the Chen name. But there were also unexpected messages of support. A cousin I'd been close to as a child. I know this must have been impossible for you. You're braver than people realize. One of my father's former employees. Thank you for having the courage to do what needed to be done. He destroyed my career when I questioned his practices. A childhood friend. Saw the news. Whatever people are saying, I know you. You did what you thought was right. The news coverage was extensive and brutal. Every major outlet ran stories about the dramatic arrest, with headlines like, Tech Mogul Arrested at Charity Gala, and FBI Infiltrates Seattle Elite Through Agents Relationship. That last one particularly stung, making it sound like Derek had deliberately targeted me as a way into my father's world. Some outlets were more measured, focusing on the financial crimes and evidence, but others sensationalized every aspect, including our relationship and my family's internal dynamics. One particularly invasive article had interviewed former classmates of mine, asking about my relationship with my father. She always seemed like she was trying too hard to get his approval, one person I barely remembered from high school told the reporter. It was actually kind of sad. The public dissection of my family's dysfunction felt like being stripped naked in front of the city. By day 3, protesters had gathered outside my parents' house in Mercer Island. Some supported my father, holding signs saying, Free Richard Chen, and FBI Overreach. Others protested his alleged crimes, demanding justice for victims. My mother had to be escorted through the crowd by police just to go to the grocery store. Images of her tear-stained face being photographed by aggressive reporters made me feel physically ill with guilt. Marcus called on the 4th day after the arrest. We need to talk, he said without preamble when I answered. Not on the phone. Can you meet me? We agreed on a coffee shop in a neutral neighborhood, somewhere neither of us frequented. When I arrived, he was already there, looking haggard. Dark circles shadowed his eyes and his usually impeccable appearance was disheveled. "Mom's had a complete breakdown," he said as soon as I sat down. "She's not eating, barely sleeping, just sitting in the house staring at nothing. Her doctor prescribed anxiety medication but she won't take it. And the lawyers, Jesus, Natalie, the legal fees are already astronomical and this has barely started." I felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. "I didn't want Mom to suffer, Marcus. You know that. But you knew she would," he shot back. "You knew exactly what this would do to her and you did it anyway." His hands trembled slightly around his coffee cup. "Dad's out on bail. $5 million. We had to put up the house as collateral. And he's not handling this well. He sits in his study making lists of everyone who betrayed him, everyone who's going to pay once he's exonerated. Your name is at the top of that list, Natalie. I don't think you understand how much danger you might be in." The implication made my blood run cold. "Are you saying Dad might try to hurt me?" Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm saying he's not rational right now. He's convinced this is all a conspiracy against him, that Derek planted evidence, that you were working with the FBI from the beginning to entrap him. The lawyers are telling him not to talk, but he won't shut up. He's going to incriminate himself even more." We sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Marcus spoke again. "I quit the company. Well, I was forced to resign, technically. The board didn't want any Chin family members associated with the business during the trial. 25 years of work, gone overnight. And Jennifer's family is pressuring her to leave me, distance herself from the scandal. I might lose my wife over this." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Marcus had made his own choices, but the collateral damage was still painful to witness. He laughed bitterly. "Are you? Really? Because it seems like you got exactly what you wanted. Dad finally faced consequences, the perfect family image shattered, and you get to feel morally superior to all of us. The accusation hung between us." "That's not what I wanted," I said quietly. "I wanted our father to be the man he pretended to be. I wanted a family that actually cared about me as much as they cared about appearances. I wanted to not have to choose between my ethics and my family. But he never gave me those options, Marcus. He made his choices long before I made mine, and checked them out." 2207 Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I hope it was worth it," he said, his voice hollow. "I hope when you're alone with your righteousness, it keeps you warm at night." He walked out without looking back, leaving me sitting in the coffee shop with cold coffee and a heart that felt like it was breaking all over again. The weeks that followed settled into a grim routine. Derek's case against my father strengthened as more evidence emerged and additional witnesses came forward. Former employees testified about being pressured to falsify records. Investors shared stories of promised returns that never materialized. The scope of the fraud was staggering, over $300 million stolen over a 15-year period. My father had been running his scheme since before I graduated high school. I threw myself into my work at the nonprofit, finding solace in helping teenagers navigate foster care systems and family trauma. The irony of my own family situation wasn't lost on my colleagues. "You're doing incredible work here," my supervisor told me during a check-in meeting. "Considering everything you're going through personally, your dedication is remarkable." I appreciated her support, though some days it felt like the only thing keeping me upright was having other people's problems to focus on besides my own. The preliminary hearings began in August, 5 months after the arrest. I didn't attend, but Derek gave me updates each evening. My father maintained his innocence, blaming subordinates and claiming he'd been deceived by his own staff. The judge wasn't buying it. "Mr. Chen, the evidence suggests you were not only aware of these activities but orchestrated them," she said during one hearing. "Please save the jury trial defense for the actual trial." My mother filed for divorce in September. The decision shocked me until I learned from Marcus that her lawyers had advised it as a way to protect whatever assets might survive the criminal proceedings. She moved into a smaller condo, stripped of the luxury she'd enjoyed for decades. I sent her flowers with a note saying I was thinking of her. She never acknowledged receiving them. The trial date was set for the following spring. In the meantime, my father's legal team tried every possible delay tactic, filing motion after motion. Derek's team countered each one methodically. The prosecution was confident. They had financial records, recorded phone calls, emails explicitly discussing the fraud. My father's co-conspirators were accepting plea deals and agreeing to testify against him. Derek and I got married in December, a small ceremony at the courthouse with just a handful of friends. No family attended from my side. My mother didn't respond to the invitation. Marcus sent a terse message declining. It should have been sad, getting married without my family present, but instead it felt like freedom. Derek's foster siblings came, the family he'd chosen rather than the one he'd been born into, and their warmth filled the spaces my blood relatives had left empty. On our wedding night, Derek held me close in our small apartment. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously. My father hated me. My mother wouldn't speak to me. My brother blamed me for destroying our family. I'd been publicly vilified by half of Seattle's elite and pitted by the other half. And yet, looking at the man I'd married, the work I did, the integrity I'd managed to maintain through it all, I found my answer. Not about us. Not about telling the truth. Maybe about the pain it caused, but not about doing what was right. The trial began on a rainy April morning. I attended the opening statements, sitting in the back of the courtroom. My father looked smaller somehow, diminished by the proceedings. He scanned the gallery before court began and his eyes found mine. For just a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been pain or regret. Then it hardened back into hatred and he looked away. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the evidence systematically. Shell companies, falsified invoices, money transferred through a network of overseas accounts. The defense argued my father was a brilliant businessman whose trust had been exploited by corrupt employees. It was a weak argument and everyone in the courtroom knew it. I didn't attend every day of the trial. I couldn't handle watching the parade of witnesses describing my father's crimes in detail. But I was there for the verdict, 3 weeks later. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before reaching their decision. Guilty on all counts. My father's face drained of color as the verdict was read. He looked frantically toward my mother, who sat stoically in the front row, her expression unreadable. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge gave my father 18 years in federal prison, citing the extent of the fraud and his complete lack of remorse. "You betrayed not just investors and business partners, but the trust of an entire community," she said. "You used philanthropic work as a cover for criminal enterprise. The sentence reflects the severity and premeditation of your actions." My father was led away in handcuffs, finally facing consequences he could not buy or manipulate his way out of. In the aftermath, I found unexpected peace. The nonprofit promoted me to director of our youth services program. Derek and I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. I reconnected with my grandmother, who had watched the trial proceedings with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Your grandfather was a good man," she told me over tea one afternoon. "I think somewhere along the way, your father decided being good wasn't enough. He wanted to be powerful. That corruption started long before the fraud." My mother eventually agreed to meet for coffee, 18 months after my father's conviction. She looked different, older, but also somehow lighter. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple, practical outfits. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said when we sat down. "Working through a lot of things I ignored for too many years." We talked carefully, like strangers learning each other's language. She didn't apologize for slapping me, but she acknowledged that she'd chosen my father's version of reality over truth for decades. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. Marcus reached out on my birthday. Just a text message, "Happy birthday, Natalie. I'm starting to understand why you did what you did. Not ready to talk yet, but wanted you to know I'm trying." Small steps, but they mattered. Derek found me crying over that message and held me as I explained that sometimes healing hurts as much as the original wound. I visited my father in prison once, 2 years into his sentence. He'd requested the visit through his lawyer, and after much deliberation, I agreed. We sat across from each other in the visitation room, separated by a table and by everything that had happened. He looked tired, his expensive haircut grown out, his confident bearing replaced by something more uncertain. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "I don't even think I deserve to ask for it. But I needed to see you, to say that I was wrong. About so many things, but especially about you." I didn't respond immediately, letting his words settle between us. "You spent my whole life telling me I wasn't good enough," I said eventually. "You made me believe I was worthless because I didn't want what you wanted. And when I finally did something that mattered, something important, you called me an embarrassment. Those words will never fully stop hurting." He nodded slowly, tears gathering in his eyes. "I know. I destroyed what could have been a relationship with an extraordinary daughter because I was too proud and too corrupt to see what actually mattered. Prison gives you a lot of time to think about the person you've been. I don't like what I see." We talked for the remaining hour, not reconciling exactly but acknowledging the reality of who we'd been to each other and who we might never be. When the visit ended, I walked out knowing I might never see him again, and finding I could live with that. Some relationships can't be repaired, and spending energy trying only causes more pain. Life moved forward. Derek made special agent in charge. We adopted a rescue dog. I started a mentorship program matching at-risk teens with positive adult role models, directly inspired by my own understanding of how crucial that support could be. The Chin family scandal eventually faded from headlines, replaced by newer controversies and fresher tragedies. I built a life defined not by my father's crimes or my family's dysfunction, but by the choices I made to live with integrity despite the cost. On quiet evenings, Derek and I would sit on our porch watching the sunset, and I would think about that text message that had started everything. "Don't come. You're an embarrassment." In trying to exclude me from his world, my father had freed me to build my own. The rejection that had felt so crushing had actually been a strange kind of gift, the final push I needed to stop seeking approval from someone who would never give it and start valuing my own moral compass instead. The embarrassment my father feared wasn't my presence at his gala. It was the truth he'd been hiding for years, the corruption that his daughter's fiancé would expose. In the end, I wasn't his embarrassment. His own choices were. And learning to separate his shame from my worth was the hardest and most necessary work I ever did. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I hope it was worth it," he said, his voice hollow. "I hope when you're alone with your righteousness, it keeps you warm at night." He walked out without looking back, leaving me sitting in the coffee shop with cold coffee and a heart that felt like it was breaking all over again. The weeks that followed settled into a grim routine. Derek's case against my father strengthened as more evidence emerged and additional witnesses came forward. Former employees testified about being pressured to falsify records. Investors shared stories of promised returns that never materialized. The scope of the fraud was staggering, over $300 million stolen over a 15-year period. My father had been running his scheme since before I graduated high school. I threw myself into my work at the nonprofit, finding solace in helping teenagers navigate foster care systems and family trauma. The irony of my own family situation wasn't lost on my colleagues. "You're doing incredible work here," my supervisor told me during a check-in meeting. "Considering everything you're going through personally, your dedication is remarkable." I appreciated her support, though some days it felt like the only thing keeping me upright was having other people's problems to focus on besides my own. The preliminary hearings began in August, 5 months after the arrest. I didn't attend, but Derek gave me updates each evening. My father maintained his innocence, blaming subordinates and claiming he'd been deceived by his own staff. The judge wasn't buying it. "Mr. Chen, the evidence suggests you were not only aware of these activities but orchestrated them," she said during one hearing. "Please save the jury trial defense for the actual trial." My mother filed for divorce in September. The decision shocked me until I learned from Marcus that her lawyers had advised it as a way to protect whatever assets might survive the criminal proceedings. She moved into a smaller condo, stripped of the luxury she'd enjoyed for decades. I sent her flowers with a note saying I was thinking of her. She never acknowledged receiving them. During this period, I found myself questioning everything about my upbringing. Late at night, I would lie awake wondering how many childhood memories were tainted by money that had been stolen. The family vacation to Europe when I was 14, had that been funded by fraud? The private school education Marcus and I received, was that paid for with stolen investments? Even the house I grew up in, with its manicured lawns and water views, suddenly felt contaminated by the knowledge of how it had been acquired. Derek noticed my spiraling thoughts and gently suggested I talk to someone. "You've experienced a massive trauma," he said one evening as we sat together in our living room. "Finding out your father is a criminal, watching your family fracture, being blamed by people you love, that's not something you just push through without processing it." I resisted at first, uncomfortable with the idea of therapy despite spending my career encouraging others to seek help. But eventually, I made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Those early therapy sessions were brutal. Dr. Lindstrom asked me to examine patterns I'd spent decades accepting as normal. "Your father's rejection wasn't about your worth," she explained during one session. "It was about control. Children who don't conform to their parents' exact specifications are seen as threats to the carefully constructed image. Your independence, your different career path, your choice of partner, all of that challenged his authority." Hearing it framed that way helped me understand that the problem had never been me. The trial date was set for the following spring. In the meantime, my father's legal team tried every possible delay tactic, filing motion after motion. Derek's team countered each one methodically. The prosecution was confident. They had financial records, recorded phone calls, emails explicitly discussing the fraud. My father's co-conspirators were accepting plea deals and agreeing to testify against him. I started attending a support group for family members of incarcerated individuals, even though my father wasn't yet in prison. The group met in a church basement every Thursday evening, a circle of folding chairs occupied by people carrying similar burdens of shame, anger, and complicated grief. Listening to their stories helped me feel less alone. A woman named Patricia, whose husband was serving time for embezzlement, told me, "The hardest part is that people expect you to either completely defend them or completely denounce them. They don't understand that you can condemn someone's actions while still grieving the relationship you thought you had." Her words resonated deeply. I didn't have to choose between justifying my father's crimes and pretending I felt nothing about his downfall. Both truths could exist simultaneously. I could believe he deserved to face consequences while also mourning the father-daughter relationship that had never actually existed but that I desperately wanted. Derek and I got married in December, a small ceremony at the courthouse with just a handful of friends. No family attended from my side. My mother didn't respond to the invitation. Marcus sent a terse message declining. It should have been sad, getting married without my family present, but instead it felt like freedom. Derek's foster siblings came, the family he'd chosen rather than the one he'd been born into, and their warmth filled the spaces my blood relatives had left empty. His foster sister Maya pulled me aside during our small reception at a neighborhood restaurant. "I know this isn't the wedding you probably imagined as a little girl," she said, squeezing my hand. "But I want you to know that what you did took incredible courage." Derek told us the whole story. A lot of people would have looked the other way to protect their own comfort. Her validation meant more than she could have known. On our wedding night, Derek held me close in our small apartment. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously. My father hated me. My mother wouldn't speak to me. My brother blamed me for destroying our family. I'd been publicly vilified by half of Seattle's elite and pitted by the other half. And yet, looking at the man I'd married, the work I did, the integrity I'd managed to maintain through it all, I found my answer. Not about us. Not about telling the truth. Maybe about the pain it caused, but not about doing what was right. The months leading up to the trial were difficult in unexpected ways. I would see fathers with their daughters around the city, walking together in the park, laughing over dinner at restaurants, the easy affection I'd never experienced, and feel a sharp pang of loss for something I'd never actually had. Dr. Lindstrom helped me work through what she called ambiguous grief, mourning both the father who had actually existed and the one I'd wished for. I also dealt with the judgment from strangers who recognized me from news coverage. Once, while grocery shopping, a woman approached me in the produce section. "You're that girl who turned in her own father," she said, her tone accusatory. I could never do that to my family. Blood is blood. I wanted to explain that my father had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars, that staying silent would have made me complicit, that loyalty shouldn't extend to covering up crimes. Instead, I simply said, "I hope you never have to make a choice like that," and walked away. But there were also moments of unexpected support. A former investor in my father's scheme tracked me down through my work email. "I know this must have been impossibly difficult for you," he wrote. "But because of your fiancé's investigation, I'm going to recover at least some of what I lost. My retirement isn't completely destroyed. Thank you for doing the right thing even when it cost you everything." I printed that email and kept it in my desk drawer for the days when doubt crept in. The trial began on a rainy April morning. I attended the opening statements, sitting in the back of the courtroom. My father looked smaller somehow, diminished by the proceedings. He scanned the gallery before court began and his eyes found mine. For just a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been pain or regret. Then it hardened back into hatred and he looked away. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the evidence systematically. Shell companies, falsified invoices, money transferred through a network of overseas accounts. The defense argued my father was a brilliant businessman whose trust had been exploited by corrupt employees. It was a weak argument and everyone in the courtroom knew it. I didn't attend every day of the trial. I couldn't handle watching the parade of witnesses describing my father's crimes in detail. But Derek would come home each evening and give me careful updates, aware that I needed to know what was happening without being overwhelmed by it. "Your father's lawyers are grasping at straws," he told me one night. "The evidence is overwhelming. I think they're already positioning for the sentencing phase, trying to argue for leniency." During the trial's third week, one of my father's former assistants testified about being ordered to forge documents and create fake investor reports. She broke down on the stand, explaining how she'd felt trapped, needing the job to support her family but knowing what she was doing was wrong. "I told myself I was just following orders," she sobbed. "That Mr. Chen was the one really responsible. But I knew. I knew it was fraud and I did it anyway because I was afraid of losing my job." Her testimony haunted me because it illustrated how my father had corrupted others, how his crimes had rippled outward affecting dozens of lives beyond just the investors he'd defrauded. I was there for the verdict, 3 weeks later. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before reaching their decision. Guilty on all counts. My father's face drained of color as the verdict was read. He looked frantically toward my mother, who sat stoically in the front row, her expression unreadable. For the first time since this began, I saw my father look genuinely afraid. The invincibility he'd worn like armor his entire life had finally cracked completely. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Derek shielded me from their cameras and questions, but I heard their shouted inquiries anyway. "Miss Chen, how do you feel about your father's conviction? Do you have any statement for the victims? Will you attend the sentencing hearing?" I kept my head down and let Derek guide me to our car, saying nothing. What could I say that would adequately capture the complexity of condemning someone's actions while grieving the relationship that could have been? Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge gave my father 18 years in federal prison, citing the extent of the fraud and his complete lack of remorse. "You betrayed not just investors and business partners, but the trust of an entire community," she said. "You used philanthropic work as a cover for criminal enterprise. The sentence reflects the severity and premeditation of your actions." My father was led away in handcuffs, finally facing consequences he could not buy or manipulate his way out of. In the aftermath, I found unexpected peace. The nonprofit promoted me to director of our youth services program, recognizing that my understanding of family trauma gave me unique insight into the challenges facing the teenagers we served. I poured myself into that work, developing new programs and expanding our reach. Every kid I helped felt like a small redemption, a way of turning my own painful experience into something meaningful. Derek and I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood far from the affluent circles my father had traveled in. It was modest, affordable on our nonprofit and government salaries, and completely ours, untainted by stolen money or fraudulent success. I planted a garden in the backyard, finding something therapeutic about nurturing growth from nothing. Those hours spent digging in the dirt, watching seedlings become plants, gave me a tangible reminder that beautiful things could emerge from careful, honest work. I reconnected with my grandmother, who had watched the trial proceedings with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Your grandfather was a good man," she told me over tea one afternoon at her retirement community. "I think somewhere along the way, your father decided being good wasn't enough. He wanted to be powerful and wealthy. That corruption started long before the fraud. I saw it beginning when he was still young, this willingness to cut ethical corners if it meant getting ahead." Her perspective helped me understand that my father's choices had deep roots, that nothing I could have done would have changed his fundamental character. My mother eventually agreed to meet for coffee, 18 months after my father's conviction. She looked different, older, but also somehow lighter. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple, practical outfits. The anxiety that had always seemed to hum beneath her polished surface had quieted. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said when we sat down. "Working through a lot of things I ignored for too many years. Things about my marriage, about how I parented you, about the person I let myself become to maintain a lifestyle." We talked carefully, like strangers learning each other's language. She didn't apologize for slapping me, but she acknowledged that she'd chosen my father's version of reality over truth for decades. "I told myself I was being a supportive wife," she said quietly. "But really, I was enabling a criminal because I enjoyed the houses and the vacations and the status. I'm ashamed of that now. And I'm ashamed of how I treated you, always making you feel secondary to your brother, letting your father diminish you." It wasn't full forgiveness exactly, but it was honest, and that mattered more than empty apologies. Marcus reached out on my birthday. Just a text message, "Happy birthday, Natalie. I'm starting to understand why you did what you did. Not ready to talk yet, but wanted you to know I'm trying." Small steps, but they mattered. Derek found me crying over that message and held me as I explained that sometimes healing hurts as much as the original wound, that being acknowledged by my brother after all this time cracked something open inside me that I'd tried to keep sealed shut. I visited my father in prison once, 2 years into his sentence. He'd requested the visit through his lawyer, and after much deliberation and several therapy sessions discussing the potential impact, I agreed. We sat across from each other in the visitation room, separated by a table and by everything that had happened. He looked tired, his expensive haircut grown out, his confident bearing replaced by something more uncertain. Prison had stripped away all the external markers of success he'd used to define himself. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "I don't even think I deserve to ask for it. But I needed to see you, to say that I was wrong. About so many things, but especially about you. You were never an embarrassment. You were the only one in our family with actual integrity, and I hated you for it because it reflected back everything I wasn't." The admission should have felt victorious, but instead it just felt sad. I didn't respond immediately, letting his words settle between us. "You spent my whole life telling me I wasn't good enough," I said eventually. "You made me believe I was worthless because I didn't want what you wanted. And when I finally did something that mattered, something important, you called me an embarrassment. Those words will never fully stop hurting, Dad. They're carved into me." He nodded slowly, tears gathering in his eyes for the first time I could ever remember seeing. "I know. I destroyed what could have been a relationship with an extraordinary daughter because I was too proud and too corrupt to see what actually mattered. Prison gives you a lot of time to think about the person you've been. I don't like what I see." We talked for the remaining hour, not reconciling exactly but acknowledging the reality of who we'd been to each other and who we might never be. He asked about my work, and for the first time in my life, actually listened to my answers without judgment or dismissal. He asked about Derek, acknowledging that he'd been wrong about him, that Derek was clearly a man of integrity and strength. It wasn't enough to repair 3 decades of damage, but it was something. When the visit ended, I walked out knowing I might never see him again, and finding I could live with that. Some relationships can't be repaired, and spending energy trying only causes more pain. Dr. Lindstrom had helped me understand that I could acknowledge my father's humanity without requiring a relationship with him, that I could hope for his rehabilitation without needing to personally witness it. Life moved forward in ways both ordinary and profound. Derek made special agent in charge of his division, a promotion that reflected his exceptional work on the case. We adopted a rescue dog named Justice, which made Derek roll his eyes at my heavy-handedness but made me smile every time I called her name. I started a mentorship program matching at-risk teens with positive adult role models, directly inspired by my own understanding of how crucial that support could be when your own family couldn't provide it. The program grew beyond my expectations. Within 2 years, we'd matched over 100 teenagers with mentors, and the outcomes were remarkable. Kids who'd been failing in school were graduating. Teenagers who'd been cycling through the juvenile justice system were staying out of trouble. And every success story felt like proof that family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up, who supports you, who believes in your worth even when your biological relatives don't. The Chin family scandal eventually faded from headlines, replaced by newer controversies and fresher tragedies. People stopped recognizing me in grocery stores. The judgmental comments ceased. I built a life defined not by my father's crimes or my family's dysfunction, but by the choices I made to live with integrity despite the cost. My identity shifted from the daughter who betrayed her father to the woman doing important work with vulnerable youth. On quiet evenings, Derek and I would sit on our porch watching the sunset over the Olympic Mountains, Justice sprawled between us, and I would think about that text message that had started everything. Don't come. You're an embarrassment. In trying to exclude me from his world, my father had freed me to build my own. The rejection that had felt so crushing had actually been a strange kind of gift, the final push I needed to stop seeking approval from someone who would never give it and start valuing my own moral compass instead. The embarrassment my father feared wasn't my presence at his gala. It was the truth he'd been hiding for years, the corruption that his daughter's fiancé would expose. In the end, I wasn't his embarrassment. His own choices were. And learning to separate his shame from my worth was the hardest and most necessary work I ever did. I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good in the moment, that standing up for truth can cost you relationships you desperately wanted to preserve, and that sometimes the family you build is more valuable than the one you were born into. Years later, I still work with teenagers who feel rejected by their families, who struggle with the impossible choice between loyalty and integrity, who wonder if their worth is defined by parental approval. And I tell them my story, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that you can survive the loss of family approval and build something meaningful from the wreckage. That your value isn't determined by whether your parents recognize it. That choosing integrity over comfort is painful but possible, and that on the other side of that choice is a life you can actually be proud of. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.